saw Dee this week at work. She was working, but I have not heard from them today. But I know Wendy and Cole, and I hope they're doing all right.
I talked to her in office the other day, just this week, and she invited her to the party, and she said she'd try to get there.
Oh, good. I hope so. That would be very good. Obviously, I did not get this set up as quickly as I liked. But also, I didn't mention that we want to keep all the people that have had tornadoes. I mean, when you think of, we may not have any internet this morning. If we don't, we'll just have to read the Bible. We'll go with that. But I don't think it's going to charge up this morning. I appreciate the prayer very much. I appreciate that you praying for us. I know you do, but I appreciate you praying for us when you're not here too. Because we need the prayers, and I appreciate that we pray together. It's not going to be there. That's all right. One of the things is we talked about last week is we wanted to talk about where do we find joy and what is the difference between happiness and joy. And where we find joy, I think, is a good question. And I appreciated all of the input that I got this week. I don't know that y'all understand how important that input is to me, but it is. I appreciate when we have a continuing conversation about whatever it is. But when we can talk about one thing on Sunday, we continue talking about it through the week, and then we have it here, that helps me, and it gives me encouragement, but also helps me to come up with ideas, and it makes me feel like we're all participating together. And I appreciate all of the responses I got this week because they were good. But when we ask the question, where do we find joy? There's always somebody willing to give you that answer, particularly in America today. And if you ask that question, if you turn the TV on to ESPN, they're going to say you're going to find joy in the game that we're showing. And I got to tell you, I probably intend to watch the Cowboys play the Washington football team this afternoon. And if Dallas wins, I'm going to be happy. If Washington wins, I'm not going to be happy. But it is not going to affect my joy. But ESPN or any of your sports stations, they want you to invest emotionally in what they're showing, whether that's a game or whatever it may be. And so when you ask, where is joy, they're going to tell you, you find it right here. If you want to watch a news program, they're going to tell you, here's joy. You watch what we show, and you can take your pick of what news channel you want to watch. You can find any side you want to find. It'll show you what you want to see, and they will give you joy. If we ask other channels where we find joy, if it's Madison Avenue, I kind of refer to Madison Avenue as the advertising industry, they're going to show you. If you want to find joy, it's going to be our toothpaste that we're advertising. You'll find joy right there. Or maybe if you just get the right hair cream, you will regrow hair, and that'll give you joy. If you just follow our commercials, you will find joy. We were watching the volleyball game last night. Kim and I were on TV. And there was an ad, of course, and it comes in, and it's just everybody's happy. They're opening presents, and they're getting together, and they're having a meal. And lots of people. And you're going through here, and you say, what are they advertising? I have that problem sometimes. You watch a commercial, and I can't even figure out what they're advertising. But this one, at the end, the very end, it comes up, joy. The word joy comes up. And then next it shows Walmart. And so they're trying to convince you, if you want joy, it's at Walmart. And I got to tell you, I think that if we're there, we're missing it. If we're finding joy at Walmart, we are missing it. But when we talk a little bit about joy, and people talk to me, there were lots of responses. And what finds joy for me and you, it may be different. Whether that's in watching our children, or whether that's watching either an animal or a human fulfill their purpose that God chose for them, or whether it is that inner finding of God. Every time, every response I got had that connection of God, of finding and seeing God present in our lives. And that's where we found joy. It was in the divine. Now today we're going to read Isaiah chapter 35. This is a chapter about joy. And we're going to read, it's not a very long chapter, but we're going to read the entire chapter, beginning in verse 1. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands, and make them firm and feeble, and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with the recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. In the haunt of jackals, where they lie down, the grass shall become reeds and rushes. And a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away. When we see this, we see creation itself is reacting with joy. At what? At the presence of God. That when the rains would come, the wilderness would bloom. The wilderness would express its joy of its Creator. And sometimes I think as humans, and this is one of the things that we see in Isaiah, that the people don't recognize their God, even though creation does. Creation recognizes where joy comes from, and it comes from God. It comes from having the presence of God in our lives. And when we look at that wilderness, how often do we see the wilderness in the Bible? You know, Abraham, he's in the Ur of the Chaldees, the city, and God calls him and sends him to the desert. We have Moses. When he's in Egypt, where does he go? He flees to the wilderness. And after he's been there for 40 years, he goes back, gets the Israelites, and where do they go? They go to the wilderness. When Elijah is fleeing from Jezebel, where does he go? He flees to the same place, to the wilderness. After Christ's baptism, where does he go? He goes to the wilderness to be tempted. We see this over and over, the importance of the wilderness to the Bible story. And what we have, and I'm not trying to say that we all need to go and go out to the desert and camp or something like that. But we see the presence of God. And that, I think, when we talk about where do we find joy, we find it in the presence of God. You know, when you think about Moses a little bit, and you know, he's shepherded sheep for his father-in-law for 40 years out in the desert, in the wilderness. And then he sees the burning bush. And he sees it. He notices it. I've thought about that sometimes. And the Bible doesn't tell us, but I wonder if God ever tried to get his attention before. And I have a message for you, Moses, and I want to get your attention. And then Moses just wasn't paying enough attention. Because I think if I was out there herding the sheep, it might take 40 years for God to get my attention, but just because I don't see. But he did. Got Moses' attention. And he calls him over there because he paid attention. And that is when he sees that that is holy ground in the presence of God. We see that over and over. You know, Paul talks to us about joy also. Sometimes when we read Paul, it seems like joy is just something that is all the time. And maybe for some people, it can be. But I think that most of us see joy in moments as opposed to all the time. Probably we should see it all the time, but I think mainly we see it in moments. But Paul talks about joy being a fruit of the Spirit. That joy comes from the Holy Spirit. And that is from the presence of God. Is where we find that inner divine as opposed to what happens outside of us. And we find that joy. Sometimes I don't think we understand joy until we look back. As that we see something happen, and maybe we don't appreciate it when it happens. But we look back on it, and we see God's presence. And once we can look back and see God's presence, I think we can find joy. That doesn't mean that we look back and we say, okay, we see why that happened. I think sometimes we don't know why things happen. I know there are times we don't know why things happen, and that's just life. Sometimes life happens. But sometimes we can look back and we can see joy. You know, Moses, we were talking about Moses. Let's look up Moses in Exodus 3. That's where he's at the burning bush. And when we look at this, he's there and he's terrified of the burning bush. And one of the things is he questions what's going on. And in verse 11 of 3, Moses says to him, "But Moses said to God, 'Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?' He said, 'But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain.'" You know, when Moses is going to go back to the people, God gives him the power to grab his staff, turn it into a snake, and turn it back into a staff. That he has the ability to put his hand in his cloak and bring it out as leprous and put it back in, and it's healed. God tells him if you take water from the Nile and pour it on the sand, it'll turn to blood. But these are all signs for the people to know that Moses came from God. The sign for Moses to know that he's being sent from God is that when you bring the people back to this mountain to worship, you will know. And I find that to be to me, that would be very confusing. If I'm looking for a sign, I want one now. And God tells him, you're going to get your sign after you've done what I've told you to do. And I think that that's an important thing to consider. That sometimes we need to look back and we see God's work in our lives. Not just always going forward. But sometimes we need to look back to find that joy. One of the things is we've gone through this pandemic, and I was telling you this morning, it's going to be hard to have court tomorrow because we've had so many people are appearing. Hopefully they'll feel well enough to appear by Zoom tomorrow, but they've come forward and said, I've got COVID, and I don't want them there. But it's going to be a challenge tomorrow. We'll adjust on the fly. But one of the things that COVID has taught us is that we need to be afraid of one another. Because we don't know. That person may be asymptomatic, doesn't even know that he has it, and yet he could be carrying the COVID virus and give it to me, and I get sick or even die. We have learned to be afraid. That's what, I'm not talking about mandates or requirements or suggestions. I'm not getting into any of that. We all know that COVID is real and that it can cause trouble. And we have to live with that. It has taught us to stay away from one another, to be afraid of one another. And when we look at that, it makes it so hard to celebrate. Now I know we're going to celebrate today. We're going to have a party today. We're going to be as cautious as we need to be, but we're going to have a party. But I think that's one of the things that we have lost during the pandemic, is that closeness. I think we've gained some things also. I think we have gained the idea that we can continue to do church, even if it's not the way we've always done it. We can still have church. But we've also lost in that idea that we need to be afraid of one another. And when we do look at the story of God, and we see and we look in here and we find the joy in here, how often do we find the people in a celebration? How often do we find the people going to a feast? Whether that's one that's prescribed by Christ or by God, or we see Christ's example. Remember when he sees Zacchaeus? What does he say to him? Today I'm coming to your house for a supper. And he shows up and he brings all of his friends with him. He eats with the Pharisees, he eats with the tax collectors, he feasts with the prostitutes and the sinners. As we have this time of celebration. And I think that when we look at the need for celebration, that we can find joy in celebrations. And that's one of the things, that's one of the responses we have, is to find joy in the celebration, particularly with our families. And I think that's important to remember. As we were talking about the wilderness, another person that went to the wilderness was John the Baptist. And remember John the Baptist? He's preaching in the wilderness, preaching for repentance to the people. And they come, and the crowd comes. And in Luke it says he calls them a brood of vipers. That's also in Mark. But he calls them a brood of vipers. But they ask him, what should we do? Now when I see this, John is preaching to the people. And I think, well, he's going to tell them, look, you need to revolt against Rome, kick them out, establish your own country. Or maybe you need to reform the tax system because it's oppressive. Or maybe you need to reform some other law. You need to change the world to make it better for Christ to come. But when we look at that, in Luke chapter 3, what does he tell the people? He says, if you see somebody hungry, you feed them. If you see somebody that needs a cloak, you clothe them. If you're a soldier, don't abuse your position. If you're a tax collector, don't take more than you should take. All of these are very concrete things looking outward. And I think when we look at joy, I do think that joy is something that we find within us, that we find divine. Joy is the divine. And happiness is just stuff that happens to us from part of the world. But when we see God, that is the time that we can find joy and we can see the divine. And that's one of the things COVID has done to us. It's made us want to put people at arm's length. That prevents us sometimes, not always, but sometimes from seeing the divine. And when we look back there in Isaiah 35, what does Isaiah tell the people to do? Offer a word of encouragement. Strengthen the weak knees. Help those with the feeble hands. And have the people, the blind, can see. And I know that's a very physical thing. We're talking about a physical inability to see. But if we had a prayer, I think one of our prayers would be, open our eyes so that we can see. So that we can see the divine in the world around us and in the people around us. So that we can also see joy. And I think if we open our eyes, we will. And I'm talking to myself right here. As we live our lives with our heads down, working away, without putting our heads up and our chins up to see the world. And I think those are mistakes. That if we want to find joy, and I think we all, why does Madison Avenue spend so much time trying to convince us that they can give us joy? Because they know that everyone is looking for joy. All of us are looking for joy. Just so often we look in the wrong place. We don't understand what God is offering, what Christ is offering. That vision of the world. Not just so we change our behavior. And I know that we want to have good behavior. But if we change our outlook on the world so that we can work towards Christ's vision of what we should be and what this world should be. And when we do that, when we look for joy, that's one way we do that. Now I'm going to read, I wanted to put it up, but it's not going to work. But this is one of the examples of joy that I got this week. Happiness is coming home after a long day. Joy is seeing the sunset God has ended the day with. And I like that one. I like that one a lot because it's not just the beauty of the sunset. It's that realization that that is something from God. That God has given us that sunset. Also, I'm going to read, this is from Philippians. And this is, of course, Paul wrote the letter to the Philippians. He's talking about joy. And he tells them, so if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord, and of one mind. Make my joy complete by being of the same mind. He's talking to a congregation there in Philippi, and he's telling them, if you want joy, and I find joy in you being unified together. That does not mean that we all are all the same. By no means does that mean that. but it means that we work together with one vision going forward as a unified people. And I think that's something to remember. This is a writer named Brene Brown. And I also like this quotation. Twinkle lights are the perfect metaphor for joy. Joy is not a constant. It comes to us in moments, often ordinary moments. Sometimes we miss out on the bursts of joy because we are too busy chasing down extraordinary moments. Other times, we're so afraid of the dark that we don't let ourselves enjoy the light. A joyful life is not a floodlight of joy. That would eventually become unbearable. I believe a joyful life is made up of joyful moments, gracefully strung together by trust, gratitude, inspiration, and faith. I like that example of joy because a couple of things. One is it's not just the floodlight, it's the little moments, those little twinkling lights that we see. And we only see them if we take the time to appreciate them. Sort of like the sunset. We know it's going to go, the sunset happens every day. But we only appreciate it as a moment of joy if we realize it is a gift from God. And also I'm going to mention Kim's. Kim on Wednesday night said, well, what are we talking about joy? And we were talking about what gives you joy. And her answer was, Mary's smile. That's what gave her joy. And sometimes we need to remember that. It is just our unity together, and it may just be a smile from you towards somebody else to give them joy. To give us that precision of twinkle lights of moments of joy that we can appreciate. And we have this offer that Christ came to give joy. Christ came to give us a hope of life, not only here, but in the future. And when we can see those little moments of joy, that is a little bit of that experience of Christ here on earth, not just in heaven, but here, when we can experience that joy. And I want to offer to you today the invitation that we do it together, that we seek joy together, that we give encouragement to one another, that we strengthen one another's weak knees. And mine are getting weaker as I get older. But we strengthen one another's weak knees, that we act facing out to others to serve others. And when we do, our hearts will be filled with joy. And if you wish to engage in that search for joy, that we find it together, we would ask that you come. If you want to put on Christ, if you need prayers, if you just need somebody to talk to, we would ask that you come as we stand and as we sing.